I spent that night in the cab of my truck parked beside the old chain gate, listening to the steady hiss of sprinklers from houses that should not have existed. Every few minutes, headlights drifted through the subdivision. Families coming home. Garage doors humming open. Dogs barking behind freshly painted fences. They all thought they lived in a normal neighborhood. The smell of cut grass floated through the warm evening air, mixing with fresh concrete and the faint chemical scent of new asphalt. None of them knew they were sitting in the middle of a property dispute that stretched back decades. By sunrise, I had not slept more than 20 minutes. The county survey map lay unfolded across my passenger seat. Coffee had gone cold in the cup holder. Red property lines crossed the page like battle scars. The deeper I looked, the worse it got. The subdivision had not just crossed onto my land. They had built directly across an old maintenance corridor that connected the reservoir spillway to the county drainage system. That corridor mattered. A lot. Around 8 that morning, I drove toward the construction office they had set up near the entrance. Pickup trucks filled the gravel lot. Nail guns cracked in the distance. Workers moved sheets of plywood while forklifts beeped constantly. The entire place smelled like sawdust and diesel fuel. The site manager recognized me immediately. His smile disappeared the second I stepped out of my truck. "You again?" he asked. I unfolded the survey map across the hood of his truck. "You built over a protected corridor." He barely glanced at it. "Not my problem." Then he pointed toward a stack of permit folders sitting inside a temporary trailer. "Everything was approved." Approved. That word stayed with me all morning. Because approval meant signatures. Signatures meant records. Records meant somebody had ignored something important. I spent the next several hours inside county offices. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Printers hummed. Clerks shuffled paperwork from one desk to another. By noon, I finally found a woman willing to help me dig through older archives. She rolled out a set of engineering plans so old the edges had turned yellow. My grandfather's name appeared on multiple pages. So did the reservoir. So did the maintenance corridor. And then I saw something that made me sit forward in my chair. A notation stamped in red ink. Federal review required before alteration of drainage infrastructure. The clerk adjusted her glasses and looked at the page. "That is unusual," she said quietly. I asked if any review had been filed during the subdivision approval process. Her keyboard clicked for nearly a minute. Then she shook her head. "Nothing. No review. No waiver. No exemption. Nothing at all." Outside the courthouse, heat waves shimmered above the pavement. My pulse felt steady for the first time since coming home. Somebody had skipped a step they were never supposed to skip. Maybe intentionally. Maybe because they thought nobody would notice. Either way, that missing review changed everything. I drove back toward the property just before sunset. Golden light reflected off rows of brand new windows. Children rode bicycles down streets that had not existed a year ago. Sprinklers sprayed perfect green lawns. It looked peaceful. But now I could see the cracks beneath the surface. Every curb. Every driveway. Every utility trench. Every permit. They all depended on paperwork that suddenly looked a lot less secure. As I parked beside the reservoir, a black luxury SUV rolled slowly to a stop near my gate. The driver's window lowered. The woman behind the wheel wore a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. She introduced herself as the president of the Homeowners Association. Her perfume drifted through the evening air, sharp and expensive. Then she told me, calmly and confidently, that I was becoming a problem for the community. I looked past her vehicle toward the reservoir behind me. Water reflected the orange glow of sunset like liquid glass. The gate rattled softly in the breeze. She thought this was about a stubborn landowner refusing to cooperate. What she did not understand was that the piece of infrastructure sitting behind that gate existed long before her subdivision, long before her board, and long before anyone decided to build houses where they never should have built them. And the deeper I dug into those records, the more I realized this was no longer about recovering property. Somebody had built an entire neighborhood on assumptions that were about to collide with reality. The next morning started with the sound of golf cart tires crunching across gravel outside my gate. I looked up from a stack of county records spread across the hood of my truck and saw 3 members of the Homeowners Association board rolling toward me like they were conducting an inspection. The air already carried the smell of fresh mulch and watered lawns drifting from the subdivision. One of them stepped out holding a clipboard. Another carried a camera. The president stood in the middle, smiling the same way she had the evening before. "We need access to inspect the reservoir," she said. I glanced at the chain stretched across the gate. "No." Her smile tightened. The camera started clicking. "This infrastructure affects our community. It affects my property." The silence that followed felt heavier than the August heat. She looked past me toward the water, then back at the documents on my truck. I could almost see her calculating. By noon, I received my answer. A certified envelope appeared in my mailbox. The paper smelled fresh from the printer. Inside was a formal demand accusing me of interfering with community operations and threatening legal action if I continued restricting access. Reading it, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because whoever wrote it clearly believed the subdivision already controlled land they had never legally acquired. That afternoon I started knocking on doors. Not inside the development. Outside it. Farmers. Ranchers. Families who had lived around the reservoir for decades. People who remembered my grandfather. The reactions surprised me. More than one neighbor invited me onto their porch before I even explained why I was there. Sweet tea. Old photographs. Stories. One retired county worker disappeared into his garage and returned carrying a weathered metal document tube. Dust covered the lid. Inside were engineering maps he had saved from a flood mitigation project years earlier. My reservoir appeared on every page. So did the maintenance corridor. And so did multiple warnings about protecting downstream drainage capacity. The retired worker tapped one section with his finger. "They should never have built there without a review." That was the second time I had heard those exact words in less than 24 hours. By sunset, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every road seemed to lead back to the same missing approval. Every document raised new questions. Every answer made the situation worse. The following week, construction accelerated anyway. Crews worked from sunrise until dark. Nail guns snapped through the air. Concrete mixers rumbled down newly paved streets. More families moved in. More sold signs disappeared from front yards. It felt like someone was racing a clock. Then another strange thing happened. A utility contractor stopped by my gate looking confused. He held a work order showing plans for additional underground lines crossing the corridor. I asked who authorized it. He gave me the name of a development consultant I had never heard before. When I checked county records later that afternoon, the consultant's name appeared on multiple applications tied to the project. So did several signatures connected to the Homeowners Association board. The deeper I dug, the smaller the world became. The same names kept surfacing. The same approvals. The same shortcuts. The smell of rain drifted through the air that evening as storm clouds gathered over the hills. I stood beside the reservoir watching ripples spread across the surface. Across the water, lights flickered on inside dozens of new homes. Families cooked dinner. Children watched television. Dogs barked from fenced backyards. They had no idea how fragile the foundation beneath their neighborhood really was. Because what I had uncovered was no longer a simple property dispute. It was starting to look like an entire development had been built on paperwork that could collapse the moment the right agency took a closer look. And for the first time since coming home, I realized the Homeowners Association was not the biggest problem. They were just the loudest face attached to something much larger hiding underneath. Rain arrived just after midnight. Not a storm. Just a steady Texas drizzle that tapped against my truck roof and turned the reservoir surface into a sheet of silver ripples. I sat there reviewing documents under a battery lantern, while the smell of wet earth drifted through the open window. Around 1 in the morning, An email notification flashed across my screen. The sender was anonymous. No name. No signature. Just a single attachment and 7 words. You are looking in the wrong place. My pulse slowed instead of speeding up. Anonymous messages usually mean one thing. Somebody is nervous. The attachment contained a scanned invoice from 3 years earlier. Engineering consultation services. Drainage impact review. The amount was nearly $80,000. The strange part was not the invoice. It was the stamp across the bottom. Cancelled before submission. I stared at it for several seconds. Somebody had ordered a review. Somebody had paid for a review. Then somebody had stopped the review before it ever reached the county. The next morning I drove straight to the engineering firm listed on the document. Their office occupied a modest brick building 20 miles away. Fresh coffee filled the lobby. Phones rang behind glass walls. Most employees refused to discuss old projects. Then an older engineer recognized the subdivision name, and his expression changed immediately. He asked me to wait. 10 minutes later he returned carrying a binder thick enough to stop a door. He could not release the documents directly, but he could answer questions. When I asked whether concerns had ever been raised about the development, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. More than concerns. That was all he said. He did not need to say more. His face did it for him. Outside, sunlight reflected off parked cars while construction cranes moved in the distance beyond town. My phone buzzed before I reached the truck. Another message. This time from a county contact I had spoken with days earlier. A public records request had suddenly appeared seeking every document connected to the reservoir and surrounding land. Someone else was digging now. The pressure was spreading. By the end of the week, strange things started happening. Survey stakes vanished. Temporary construction fencing appeared overnight near sections of the corridor. Workers stopped answering simple questions. One contractor actually packed up equipment and left before finishing a scheduled installation. Rumors moved faster than facts. The Homeowners Association tried controlling the narrative. Community newsletters suddenly described the reservoir as outdated infrastructure. Social media posts accused me of delaying progress. A special meeting was announced at the clubhouse. They wanted residents unified. That word caught my attention. Unified against what exactly? Curiosity got the better of me. I attended the meeting. The clubhouse smelled like fresh carpet and artificial vanilla candles. Folding chairs filled the room. Nearly every seat was occupied. Homeowners sat shoulder to shoulder holding printed agendas. The board president stood at the front beneath bright fluorescent lights speaking with complete confidence. She talked about growth, property values, community investment. Then she made a mistake. She displayed a development map on a projection screen. Most people saw roads and lots. I saw something else. A section highlighted in yellow. Future expansion phase. The highlighted area sat directly on top of land still listed under my family's ownership. The room kept listening. The presentation continued. But I barely heard another word. Because at that exact moment I realized this entire fight had never been about the houses already built. Those were only the beginning. They were planning to expand even farther, and if the documents in my truck were accurate, they were preparing to repeat the same shortcut that started this whole mess. The difference was that now I knew where to look, and somewhere inside the growing pile of records was the piece of evidence that could bring the entire operation to a halt. I left the clubhouse before the meeting ended. The smell of burnt coffee and air freshener followed me into the parking lot as the evening sun dropped behind rows of identical rooftops. My truck door slammed shut, and the sound echoed across the nearly empty lot. That yellow expansion zone stayed burned into my mind the entire drive home. They had already built enough to create a legal nightmare. Expanding farther would multiply every risk tied to the corridor, the drainage system, and the missing reviews. Somebody was betting that no one would stop them. The next morning I filed 3 separate public records requests. One for engineering correspondence. One for zoning communications. one for development approvals connected to future phases. Then I waited. Waiting turned out to be harder than digging. Days passed. Construction noise continued from sunrise to sunset. Concrete saws screamed in the distance. Dump trucks rolled through the subdivision. Fresh lumber filled the air with the smell of cut pine. Outwardly, everything looked normal. Underneath, pressure was building. The first records arrived 5 days later. Thousands of pages. Emails. Meeting notes. Internal memos. Most were routine. Then I found a thread buried between scheduling updates and permit discussions. An engineer had raised concerns about drainage capacity years earlier. Another employee recommended additional review. A third email simply said the concerns would be addressed at a later stage. There was no evidence they ever were. I printed the entire chain and spread it across my kitchen table. The paper covered nearly every inch of the surface. Coffee cooled beside me while I traced dates with a highlighter. The timeline told a story nobody wanted told. Questions had been asked. Warnings had been given. Then the project moved forward anyway. That weekend, a county commissioner returned my call. We met at a diner 20 miles outside town. The place smelled like bacon grease and fresh biscuits. Ceiling fans spun lazily overhead while ranchers filled the booths. I brought copies of the documents. He spent nearly 20 minutes reading without speaking. Finally, he placed the papers on the table and looked directly at me. "You need an independent review." Hearing those words felt different than hearing legal theories or rumors. This came from someone who had seen development battles before. Someone who understood what records could become once the right experts examined them. The review process started the following week. Surveyors appeared first. Then environmental consultants. Then drainage specialists. White trucks lined sections of the property. Equipment clicked and hummed as measurements were taken. The Homeowners Association noticed immediately. Their newsletter changed tone overnight. Instead of confidence, there was irritation. Instead of celebration, there were complaints. Residents began asking questions. Why were survey crews back? Why were consultants walking the corridor? Why were county officials requesting information? For the first time, the board stopped looking untouchable. Then came the moment that changed everything. A consultant called me late on a Thursday afternoon. Wind noise crackled through his phone. I could hear equipment operating somewhere behind him. His voice sounded careful. Professional. The kind of careful that usually means trouble. He explained that preliminary findings showed discrepancies between approved plans and actual construction locations. Not small discrepancies. Significant ones. I stood beside the reservoir listening to him speak while sunlight reflected off the water. Every ripple seemed brighter than before. The gate chain rattled softly in the breeze. Across the reservoir, children played in backyards. Lawn mowers droned in the distance. Life continued as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. The first independent findings had finally arrived, and they pointed directly at the one thing the board had spent months insisting did not exist. A problem big enough that outside agencies would almost certainly want answers. And once those agencies started asking questions, control would begin slipping away from the people who thought they owned the narrative. The first official notices went out 2 weeks later. I was standing beside the reservoir when my phone started vibrating nonstop. Emails. Text messages. Missed calls. The air smelled like wet grass after an early morning irrigation cycle, and somewhere across the water a lawn crew was already running blowers. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary routines. But nothing about that day was ordinary. Independent reviewers had completed enough work to trigger formal inquiries. The county requested supplemental documentation. State regulators requested clarification on drainage compliance. Additional records were ordered preserved. For the first time since I returned home, the momentum shifted. The board tried acting calm. Publicly, they insisted everything was routine. Privately, it was a different story. I knew because people started talking. Contractors who had refused calls suddenly wanted meetings. Former employees returned messages. Even a real estate agent who had marketed dozens of homes inside the development reached out. We met at a coffee shop on the edge of town. The smell of roasted beans filled the room while ceiling speakers played soft country music. She slid a folder across the table and lowered her voice. Inside were marketing materials from years earlier. Most looked harmless. Neighborhood renderings. Future development maps. Sales projections. Then I noticed something unusual. Several maps showed property boundaries that did not match county records. Not close. Not even approximately. Entire sections had been illustrated as future community land despite never being transferred. The more I looked, the more uncomfortable she became. I always assumed legal reviewed everything, she admitted. That sentence followed me all week. Everybody assumed someone else had checked. Somebody else had verified. Somebody else had protected the process. Assumptions built the neighborhood. Documents were starting to tear those assumptions apart. A few days later, survey crews returned with upgraded equipment. Tripods appeared across open lots. Measurement poles stood beside sidewalks. Residents gathered outside watching from driveways. Questions spread faster than answers. Social media groups exploded with speculation. Some blamed developers. Some blamed regulators. Some blamed the board. Through it all, the board president continued projecting confidence. Until the special community meeting. The clubhouse overflowed that night. Folding chairs filled every corner. People stood along walls. Others watched through open doors from outside. The room felt warmer than usual. Tension hung in the air heavier than humidity. Questions started immediately. Homeowners wanted to know whether their properties were affected. Whether future phases would continue. Whether ongoing investigations posed financial risks. The board offered carefully prepared statements. Then a resident stood up holding one of the public reports. I recognized the document instantly. Silence settled over the room as he read portions aloud. Every sentence landed harder than the last. Missing reviews? Unresolved discrepancies. Inconsistent site plans? Nobody shouted. Nobody needed to. The facts did enough damage by themselves. I watched expressions change across the room. Confidence gave way to concern. Concern gave way to doubt. By the time the meeting ended, people were no longer asking whether there was a problem. They were asking how large the problem had become. Outside, the parking lot glowed beneath yellow streetlights. Crickets chirped from nearby drainage ditches. Homeowners lingered beside their vehicles speaking in hushed voices. The board left quickly. Too quickly. That alone told me everything. Because powerful people do not rush away from questions unless they are running out of answers. 3 days later, another report arrived from the consultants. I opened it while sitting at my kitchen table before sunrise. Steam rose from a fresh cup of coffee. The house was completely silent. Halfway through the report, I stopped reading and stared out the window. The consultants had finally identified the exact location where approved plans and actual construction diverged. It was not a small discrepancy. It sat directly at the center of everything I had been investigating for months. And according to their findings, fixing it would force agencies to examine far more than a single section of land. It would force them to examine the entire project from the beginning. The county hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. By 7 o'clock the parking lot was already full. Pickup trucks lined one side. Sedans filled the other. The air smelled like fresh pavement warming under the sun. I sat on the tailgate of my truck drinking coffee while reviewing notes I had practically memorized by then. Across the lot, members of the board arrived in small groups. Their confidence looked different now. Less polished. More cautious. Inside the building, fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Rows of chairs filled quickly. Residents from the subdivision showed up carrying folders, printouts, and questions. Some looked frustrated. Others looked nervous. Most simply wanted answers. The hearing started with procedural updates. Agency representatives summarized findings. Consultants presented maps. Engineers displayed diagrams on projection screens. Every news slide seemed to remove another layer of certainty from the story the board had spent years telling. Then came the report that changed the room. A senior reviewer stepped forward and outlined the discrepancy at the center of the investigation. Approved boundaries. Actual construction. Drainage infrastructure. Utility routing. The pieces finally connected into a picture everyone could understand. The room fell silent. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. The facts were too specific. Too documented. Too consistent. I watched several residents exchange looks as they realized the issue was not theoretical anymore. It was real. It affected decisions, approvals, and future development plans. The board president requested an opportunity to respond. Her voice remained steady at first. She talked about growth, community benefits, good intentions. Then questions started coming from homeowners. Direct questions. Practical questions. Questions about disclosures, records, and representations. The kind of questions that cannot be answered with slogans. One by one, confidence drained from the room. By lunch, agencies announced additional reviews would continue and several pending approvals would be paused until matters were resolved. That single announcement hit harder than anything else said that day. The development machine that had seemed unstoppable suddenly slowed. Outside, clusters of residents gathered beneath the shade of oak trees discussing what they had heard. The smell of food trucks drifted across the parking lot. Conversations stretched from property values to infrastructure concerns to accountability. For the first time, people were comparing documents instead of rumors. A week later, the effects became visible. Future expansion activity stopped. Survey stakes remained untouched. Equipment disappeared from staging areas. Marketing signs advertising upcoming phases quietly vanished. Even the community newsletters changed tone again. The certainty was gone. In its place came careful wording and legal disclaimers. I spent most evenings by the reservoir watching sunlight fade across the water. The chain gate still rattled softly whenever the wind picked up. The same gate that had become a symbol of the entire fight. Not because it blocked access. Because it marked a boundary that should have been respected from the beginning. One evening an elderly resident approached while I was standing near the shoreline. He introduced himself and pointed toward the subdivision lights glowing in the distance. Then he said something I never forgot. This stopped being about land a long time ago. He was right. The fight had started with property. It had grown into something larger. Records. Responsibility. Trust. The simple expectation that rules apply equally no matter how powerful someone believes they are. As darkness settled across the reservoir, reflections shimmered across the water like scattered glass. The neighborhood remained standing. Families still lived there. Children still played there. Life continued. But the illusion that nobody would ever question the foundation beneath it had finally cracked. And somewhere inside county offices, state agencies, engineering reports, and preserved records, the final pieces were still moving into place. The people who ignored warnings had spent years assuming nobody would connect the dots. Now the dots were connected, and the story was no longer under their control. 3 months after the hearing, the subdivision looked different. Not physically at first. The houses were still there. The lawns were still trimmed. Sprinklers still clicked across perfectly green grass every morning. But the mood had changed. You could feel it the moment you drove past the entrance. The confidence was gone. In its place sat uncertainty. One cool October morning, I pulled up beside the reservoir and noticed something I had not seen in months. Silence. No construction equipment. No backup alarms. No framing crews. No concrete trucks. The only sounds came from wind moving through the trees and water lapping softly against the shoreline. The smell of damp leaves drifted across the property. It felt like the land was finally taking a breath. The official findings arrived later that week. A thick package landed on my kitchen table just after sunrise. I spent hours reading through every page. Engineering reviews. Agency responses. Compliance summaries. Technical language filled most of the report, but the conclusions were surprisingly clear. Multiple approvals would need reevaluation. Future expansion could not proceed under existing assumptions. Additional corrective measures would be required before several long-term plans could move forward. Nobody celebrated publicly. There was no dramatic announcement. No television crews. No grand speeches. Real accountability rarely looks like a movie. It looks like paperwork. It looks like signatures. It looks like decisions quietly reversing years of momentum. The board attempted one final campaign. Newsletters appeared claiming misunderstandings had been exaggerated. Community meetings promised transparency. New committees were formed. Consultants were hired. But residents had spent months reading documents for themselves. The old strategy no longer worked. People asked harder questions now. They requested records. They compared statements against reports. They wanted facts instead of assurances. One evening I attended another community meeting. The clubhouse felt strangely different. The same fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The same folding chairs filled the room. Yet the atmosphere had completely changed. Residents spoke openly. Board members listened more than they talked. Several homeowners stood and described how they wanted the community rebuilt on trust instead of assumptions. Listening to them, I realized something important. Most of the families living there had never been the problem. They bought homes, raised children, built lives. They believed professionals had done their jobs correctly. In many ways, they had been caught in the middle just like everyone else. After the meeting, I walked outside into cool evening air. The scent of wood smoke drifted from a nearby backyard fire pit. Streetlights reflected off parked cars. The board president emerged from the clubhouse a few minutes later. For the first time since I met her, she looked tired. Not angry. Not defensive. Just tired. We exchanged a brief nod. No speeches. No arguments. The fight had moved beyond personal conflict long ago. The records had already spoken. Winter arrived slowly. Brown leaves gathered along fence lines. The reservoir dropped a few inches as colder weather settled in. I spent more time restoring sections of the property that had been neglected during the dispute. Old gates received fresh paint. Trails were cleared. Survey markers were replaced. Every small project felt like reclaiming a piece of normal life. One afternoon, while standing beside the chain gate that started everything, I looked across the water toward the neighborhood beyond. Sunlight reflected off dozens of windows. Children rode bicycles along sidewalks. Dogs chased tennis balls across backyards. Life continued. That was the irony of the entire story. The land had never needed revenge. The reservoir had never needed revenge. The documents did all the work. The truth sat quietly in county archives, engineering files, forgotten permits, and faded maps waiting for someone patient enough to connect the pieces. In the end, the loudest people in the room did not win. The people with the biggest titles did not win. The people who assumed nobody would check their work did not win. The facts won. And standing there beside the water my grandfather protected for decades, I realized that was probably the most satisfying outcome of all. Spring arrived almost a year after I first pulled back into the property, and found strangers treating boundaries like suggestions. Wildflowers appeared along the reservoir shoreline. Fresh grass pushed through patches of earth that had been churned up by months of surveys and inspections. Mornings felt quieter now. The constant tension that had hung over the land had finally started to fade. One Saturday, I walked the perimeter with a clipboard in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. The air smelled like cedar, damp soil, and fresh water. Birds skimmed low across the reservoir surface. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn-mower hummed for a few minutes before falling silent again. Normal sounds. The kind of sounds I had spent months fighting to hear again. By then, corrective plans had been approved. Property records had been updated. Boundaries had been clarified. Agencies had finished most of their reviews. The expansion plans that once seemed inevitable had become history. What remained was a community learning how to move forward with a clearer understanding of what had happened. The biggest surprise came from the residents themselves. Over time, more homeowners started stopping by the gate. Not to argue. Not to complain. Just to talk. Some wanted to understand the history of the reservoir. Others wanted to know about my grandfather. A few admitted they had believed the early rumors before reading the reports themselves. Those conversations mattered more than any hearing ever could. Because once people saw the documents, most reached the same conclusion. The conflict had never been about resisting growth. It had been about respecting facts. One afternoon, a family invited me to a neighborhood picnic held near the edge of the development. Children ran through open fields chasing soccer balls. Folding tables overflowed with barbecue, lemonade, and homemade desserts. The smell of smoked brisket drifted through the warm air. Standing there, I realized how different everything felt from that first day back. Fear had been replaced with transparency. Assumptions had been replaced with questions. And questions had eventually led people to the truth. Later that evening, I returned to the reservoir alone. The sun hung low over the water, turning the surface gold. I rested one hand against the old chain gate. The same gate that had rattled in the wind during countless early mornings and late nights. The same gate people had tried to treat like an obstacle when it was really a reminder. Boundaries exist for a reason. Stewardship matters. Records matter. Truth matters. Looking across the water, I thought about how many opportunities there had been for someone to do the right thing earlier. A single review. A single correction. A single honest conversation. Any one of those choices could have prevented years of trouble. Instead, people relied on assumptions and momentum. In the end, either survived contact with the facts. The reservoir remained exactly where it had always been. The land remained exactly where it had always been. What changed was the story surrounding them. And as the last light reflected across the water, I realized my grandfather had been right about something he used to tell me as a kid. Land remembers. Not through anger. Not through revenge. Through records, history, and patience. Long after arguments fade, the truth stays exactly where it was left. Justice is not loud. It does not need to be. Given enough time, enough evidence, and enough persistence, it becomes inevitable.